Chapter 1. Chapter title, The Sterile Syllabus. The leather-bound planner sat open on the hood of the car, its cream pages waiting for a 12-week botanical restoration schedule. Hanae Ishida stood on the gravel driveway, smoothing the creases of her ivory linen suit with palms that refused to stop trembling. To her left, the ancestral farm stretched out like a bruised memory, a sprawling expanse of land that had forgotten the taste of rain. The air smelled of old iron and coastal brine. She adjusted her glasses and began to map the territory, dividing the acreage into quadrants and assigning each a recovery timeline based on soil depletion and historical yield. Order was the only currency she trusted, and she intended to spend it lavishly. For the first 3 days, Hanae operated with the clinical precision of a surgeon. She treated the earth not as a living thing, but as a series of chemical deficits. In the shed, she measured nitrogen-rich fertilizer with a digital scale and stirred pH-adjusted water with a sterilized rod until the alkalinity hit a perfect 6.5. She moved through the rows in a military posture, her spine a rigid line that defied the slouching willow trees. She ignored the wind pulling in her clothes, logging every action in her planner in sharp, disciplined needles of ink. By the 4th morning, frustration itched under her skin. She knelt at the edge of the primary plot, her knees protected by a plastic mat to keep the linen pristine. She stared at the soil. It was a stubborn, ash-gray void, the color of a television tuned to a dead channel. Despite optimal nutrients and precise hydration, the ground remained dormant. Not a single sprout, weed, or thistle dared to pierce the crust. It was a biological impossibility. According to the laws of botany, the nitrogen should have triggered a response. The phosphorus should have encouraged roots. The land was simply refusing the data. "The variables are controlled," she whispered, her voice thin and academic. "The inputs are optimal. There is no logical reason for the absence of germination." She stood abruptly, her glasses jarring askew. She felt an irrational urge to scream at the dirt, to demand it, explain its defiance. She had spent 30 years in city lecture halls teaching that nature followed predictable rules. To encounter a plot that ignored the basic tenets of chemistry was a systemic rebellion. She paced the row, her heels clicking on the hard-packed earth, searching for a name for the void, a label that would fit neatly into a spreadsheet. "You are feeding the stomach, but the heart is starving," a voice rasped. Hanae spun around. Suleiman Al-Farsi stood at the edge of the plot, appearing as if carved from the shadows of the tree line. He leaned on a wooden cane, his frame bent like a windswept pine, while a string of dark prayer beads clicked rhythmically through his fingers. His eyes were clouded with cataracts, yet he seemed to look right through her suit to the tension in her shoulders. "The soil salinity is within the acceptable range for most angiosperms," Hanae responded, regaining her professional distance. "I have checked the drainage and mineral composition. If there is a deficiency, it is not one solved by metaphors, Mr. Al-Farsi. I am following a standard restoration protocol." Suleiman did not argue. He closed his eyes and tilted his head, listening to the wind rattle the dry seed pods of the scrub. The click-clack of the beads continued, a steady metronome. He treated her presence as a momentary disturbance in the atmosphere. To Hanae, the silence was a vacuum where a helpful answer should have been. "Why are you not answering me?" she asked, stepping toward him. "You were the caretaker here for decades. Is there a toxin in the groundwater?" Suleiman opened one eye, a sliver of amber peering through the haze. "The land does not remember the water, Hanae. It remembers the people. It remembers what they brought in their pockets and what they left behind in their chests." He drifted away, his cane thumping softly against the earth. Hanae opened her mouth to deliver a rebuttal about the absurdity of emotional soil science, but as she turned back to the gray void, a sharp memory pierced her fortifications. The smell of damp wool and static. The day of her mother's funeral. She remembered the cold rain turning the cemetery into a slurry of mud and the suffocating silence of the mahogany casket. She remembered standing rigid, refusing to cry because grief felt like a lack of discipline. She remembered the crushing weight of the apologies she had filed away in a mental cabinet and locked tight. The academic facade crumbled. The memory was a physical blow. A wave of raw grief surged upward, catching in her throat like a jagged stone. For the first time in years, Hanae didn't try to categorize the feeling. She let it break her. As the image of her mother's pale, still hand flashed before her, a single jagged sob escaped her lips. At that exact moment, the ground beneath her feet shuddered. From the center of the ash-gray void, a shoot erupted with violent speed. It didn't grow, it surged. In a heartbeat, a thick, succulent stem pushed through the crust, unfolding a single massive bloom. It was a crimson so deep it bordered on purple, a bleeding red painted onto the gray landscape. The flower was magnificent and terrifying, its petals shimmering with dew like liquid silver. It defied every law of botany. There had been no seed, only a sudden response to a burst of sorrow. Hanai froze, her glasses dangling precariously from her nose. The contrast between the red and the gray was a visual scream. She reached out, her fingers trembling, but stopped short of the petal. The flower pulsed, a slow, rhythmic throb that mirrored her own heart. As she stood suspended in the shock of the miracle, she felt a prickle of awareness on the back of her neck. She looked toward the tree line, where the shadows shifted. A figure stood there, partially obscured by the hanging boughs of an ancient oak. The face was hidden in the gloom, but the gaze was unmistakable, steady, observant, and cold. Hanai tried to call out, but her voice was gone, swallowed by the sudden oppressive silence of the farm. Chapter 2. Hanai found him in the potting shed, a space that smelled of damp cedar, oxidized iron, and the sharp tang of old shears. Suleiman was not working. He sat on a low wooden stool, his spine curved like a question mark, slowly rolling a string of amber prayer beads to his calloused fingers. The click-clack of the beads provided a rhythmic counterpoint to the distant, rhythmic thrum of the coast. Hanae stopped 3 feet from him, her boots clicking sharply on the concrete floor, her posture as rigid as a fence post. She did not offer a greeting. Instead, she gripped the edge of a potting bench, her knuckles white against the grime. "I need the documentation," Hanae said, her voice clipped and precise. "The manual, the ledger, or the botanical logs. Whatever records exist regarding the mechanism of the crimson bloom. I witnessed a spontaneous biological event yesterday, a plant erupting from sterile soil in response to a psychological trigger. That is not a coincidence. It is a process. I want the guidelines for that process." Suleiman did not look up. The amber beads continued their slow migration. He let a long silence stretch between them, a gap so wide that Hanai felt the urge to fill it with a list of citations. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough rasp, sounding like river stones grinding together in a current. "You speak of mechanisms, Hanai Ishida, as if the earth were a clock you could take apart with a jeweler's screwdriver," he said. "You want a grammar for a language you have spent 30 years forgetting. There is no book. There is only the language of the heart, and the heart does not keep a ledger." Hanai felt a surge of irritation that manifested as a sharp twitch in her left eyelid. She adjusted her glasses, pushing them up the bridge of her nose with a singular, forceful motion. "Let us be reasonable. I am not asking for poetry. I am asking for the causal link. Any biological response, no matter how anomalous, must have a trigger and a repeatable process. If the soil is reactive to emotional stimuli, there is a chemical or energetic catalyst involved. If I can identify the catalyst, I can categorize the response. I can manage it." Suleiman finally lifted his head. His eyes were clouded with cataracts, yet they seemed to pierce through her, looking not at her face, but at the space just behind her ribs. He stopped the beads. The sudden silence in the shed felt heavy, like a wet blanket draped over the room. "Manage it," he repeated, the words tasting of irony. "You wish to manage the grief of your ancestors. Tell me then, describe that flower you saw yesterday. Describe it to me now. But you must not use a single word from your textbooks. No Latin, no terminology of botany, no academic descriptors. Tell me what it was, simply." Hanai opened her mouth to speak, but the words stalled. She instinctively reached for pigmentation and vascular pressure, but the constraints of his request acted like a wall. She shifted her weight, her military posture stiffening until her shoulders were practically touching her ears. She tried to visualize the bloom, the violent bleeding red, the silver dew, and then she tried to find a word for the feeling that had summoned it. She thought of the mud at the cemetery. She thought of the mahogany casket. She thought of the silence of her mother's hand. The air in the shed suddenly felt too thick to breathe, as if the cedar scent had become a physical weight. She opened her mouth again, but no sound emerged. The void where her academic vocabulary usually lived was suddenly an abyss. She stood there, a retired educator of 30 years, rendered mute by the absence of a category. Suleiman watched her, his expression neither pitying nor triumphant, merely observant. He reached beneath the potting bench and pulled out a rusted tin box, the lid dented and painted a faded ochre. He opened it slowly, revealing rows of old seed packets, their paper yellowed and brittle, the ink bleeding into the grain. Some were hand-lettered in a script that looked like wind-blown grass. Others were blank, save for a small, dried, pressed petal taped to the front. "These are the sleepers," Suleiman said, his voice softening. Hanae reached forward, her fingers itching to organize them, to alphabetize them by species or origin. But Suleiman snapped the lid shut with a definitive metal-sharp clang just inches from her fingertips. "They will not wake for a stranger," he said. "I am not a stranger," Hanae countered, her voice trembling slightly. "I am the heir to this land. This is my ancestral home." "You are a visitor who happens to share the blood," Suleiman replied. He leaned heavily on his carved wooden cane, the wood groaning under his weight. "You have treated this farm as a ghost story you could ignore by staying in a city of concrete and logic. But the land does not forget. This farm is not a garden, Hanae. It is a mirror. For 3 decades, you and your kin have lived in emotional exile. You have cultivated a desert inside yourselves, and so the soil became a desert. The sterility you see outside is merely the reflection of the silence you kept inside." Hanae recoiled as if he had struck her. She smoothed the fabric of her trousers, her hands shaking. The implication was an indictment that her discipline, her carefully constructed walls of order and professionalism, were not just personal choices, but a physical blight upon the earth. The thought that her 30-year avoidance of the farm had acted as a weight, crushing the life out of the root systems, made her stomach churn. "That is an illogical leap," she whispered, though the precision had left her voice. "Environmental degradation is a result of soil pH, nitrogen depletion, and neglect. Not emotional exile." Suleiman stood up slowly, his joints popping like dry twigs. He looked toward the open door of the shed, where the gray, dormant fields stretched toward the horizon, shimmering under a pale, oppressive sun. "The nitrogen is fine, Professor," he said, using her former title as a reminder of the world she had tried to bring with her. "The water is sufficient. The farm did not die of disease, and it did not die of neglect. It simply stopped reflecting a family that had stopped feeling. It went to sleep because there was nothing left in you worth waking up for." He turned and began to limp away, the rhythmic click-clack of his beads resuming. Hanae remained in the shed, surrounded by the smell of old iron and cedar, staring at the closed ochre tin. She felt a sudden, terrifying sensation in her chest, a loosening of a knot she hadn't known was tied. As she stepped out of the shed and back into the gray light, she noticed something. At the edge of the gravel path, where her boots had scuffed the dirt in her agitation, a tiny pale shoot had broken the surface. It wasn't the violent red of the previous day's bloom. It was a translucent, ghostly white, shivering in the breeze, mirroring the exact shade of the fear currently blooming in the pit of her stomach. Chapter 3. Rohan arrived not with a greeting, but with a collision. He burst through the rusted iron gate mid-stride, the metal screeching against the stone path, clutching a stainless steel soil sampler like a holy relic. He was breathing hard, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose, and he didn't stop until he was inches from Hanae's face, smelling of static crackle and old paper. "It's anomalous bioresonance, Hanae. Completely unprecedented," he said, the words tumbling over one another in a frantic rush. "I've been reviewing the historical precipitation charts for this coastal strip, and there is no chemical justification for the localized sterility. None. But the cellular memory of the soil, if we treat the mycelial network as a recording medium, suggests a systemic shutdown. It's not a lack of nutrients. It's a refusal to metabolize." Hanae stepped back, her military posture tightening. She adjusted her glasses with a sharp, precise flick of her finger. "I am unfamiliar with the term refusal to metabolize in a botanical context, Rohan. Plants do not possess the agency to refuse. They react to stimuli. If the soil is sterile, we identify the inhibitor and neutralize it. We do not assign it a temperament." "That is exactly the problem with the pedagogical approach," Rohan countered, his voice jumping an octave. He began to pace a tight circle around the ghostly white shoot that had emerged the previous day, his boots kicking up puffs of gray dust. "You are treating this like a classroom where the students can be shamed into obedience. This isn't a lesson plan. It's a biological anomaly. We need to map the dead zones, quantify the variance, and isolate the variable." For the next 4 hours, they formed an uneasy alliance of the intellect. They moved through the garden with surgical precision, dividing the gray expanse into a grid. Hanai brought her ledger, marking the coordinates of every dormant root with a fine-tipped pen, while Rohan plunged his sampler into the earth, extracting cores of dirt that looked like compressed ash. They worked in a silence that was not peaceful but competitive, a shared desire to conquer the land through sheer force of categorization. They avoided the edges of the property where the shadows felt heavier, focusing instead on the center of the plot. Rohan's detachment was absolute. He spoke of the floor as specimens, and the soil as the substrate. He treated the garden as a puzzle to be solved, a machine with a broken gear. As they worked, Hanaya noticed something peculiar. In the exact spots where Rohan's clinical focus was most intense, the earth began to stir. Small, twisted stalks began to push through the dirt. They weren't flowers, they were stunted, gray protrusions, corkscrewed and blind, looking more like calcified fingers than plants. They were the physical manifestation of a sterile curiosity, devoid of warmth or intent. "Look at this," Rohan said, kneeling beside a cluster of the gray stalks. He poked one with a probe, his expression one of distant fascination. "The growth is stunted, likely due to a lack of hormonal triggers. It's a perfect specimen of arrested development." Hanai looked at the stunted things and felt a surge of irritation. The gray stalks mirrored the rigidity of her own life, the years spent in libraries, the meticulously graded papers, the silence of a home where emotion was considered a lapse in discipline. "It is an eyesore," she said, her voice clipped. "And it is inefficient. If we are to revive this farm, we cannot rely on these distortions. We need a systemic stimulus, a proper fertilization cycle." "Fertilizer won't fix a broken signal," Rohan snapped, standing up abruptly. "You're trying to apply a textbook to a living entity that is actively ignoring your rules. Your insistence on order is just another form of the same silence that killed this place in the first place." "How dare you," Hanai said, her voice trembling. She felt the familiar heat rising in her neck, the sudden urge to smooth her trousers to keep from shaking. "I have spent 30 years mastering the art of stability. I have built a life on the foundation of logic because the alternative is chaos. I will not have my professional integrity questioned by someone who treats a garden like a laboratory slide." "Stability is just another word for stagnation," Rohan yelled, his face flushing. "You're so terrified of a single unplanned emotion that you've turned yourself into a statue." "And what about you?" Hanai screamed back, the sound tearing from her throat raw and jagged. "You hide behind your samplers and your bioresonance because you can't stand the weight of your own silence. You are just as sterile as this soil, Rohan. I am terrified that I am exactly like this land, that there is nothing left inside me but dust and dead roots." The silence that followed was sudden and heavy, as if a curtain had been dropped over the world. Hanai was breathing hard, her glasses slipping down her nose, her chest heaving. She studied Rohan and saw that the scientific mask had shattered. His shoulders slumped and he looked away, his gaze falling to the mud-caked boots of his shoes. "I lost my sister 4 years ago," Rohan said, his voice suddenly small, stripped of its theoretical armor. "She was the one who loved the earth. I moved here because I thought if I could find a scientific explanation for why things stop growing, why a heart just quits, I could finally stop feeling like the world is a random, cruel accident. I didn't come here for the anomaly. I came here because I'm tired of being the only thing in my life that doesn't know how to bloom." As the admission hung in the air, the ground beneath them didn't just move, it heaved. A low, guttural groan vibrated through the soles of their shoes, a sound like a giant waking from a century of sleep. Hanai gasped, clutching Rohan's arm for balance. Then, the explosion happened. It wasn't a burst of fire, but a violent eruption of color. From the very center of their grid, a wave of iridescent blue flora tore through the gray crust. The plants didn't grow. They surged, unfolding in chaotic, fractal patterns that defied every law of botany Hanai knew. The blue was electric, a shade that seemed to vibrate against the pale sky, smelling of crushed mint and static crackle. The growth was so sudden and forceful that it knocked Rohan backward, sending him tumbling into a thick hedge of thorns. His notebook flew from his hand, landing with a wet slap in a pool of dark mud. Hanai stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat. She watched as the blue vines spiraled upward, weaving themselves into a canopy that shimmered with a strange internal light. She stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch a petal that felt like cool silk and humming electricity. As she leaned in, she noticed a rhythmic pulsing in the petals. The iridescent blue flared and dimmed in a slow, steady cadence. She froze, realizing the rhythm was familiar. She pressed her hand to her own chest, feeling the thrum of her heart, and then looked at Rohan, who was struggling to untangle himself from the thorns. The flowers were pulsing in perfect synchronization with their heartbeats. The garden was no longer just reflecting their states. It had wired itself directly into their volatility, turning their shared grief into a living, breathing, blue delirium. Chapter 4. The iron gates groaned, a sound like a long-forgotten door opening into a cellar, as Hanae slid the bolt back. She had spent 3 hours arranging the gravel paths into precise linear vectors, ensuring that the gathered locals would move in a predictable clockwise circuit. She stood at the entrance, her spine a rigid line, wearing a linen blazer that felt like a suit of armor. To her, this was not a garden party. It was a controlled social observation. She wanted to quantify the resonance, to see if the iridescent blue flora, still humming from the encounter with Rohan, would react to the collective psyche of the village with the same volatility it had shown to individual grief. "Please, stay within the demarcated zones," Hanae instructed the small group, her voice clipped and academic. She pointed to the chalk lines she had meticulously drawn across the soil. "The vegetation is currently in a state of heightened sensitivity. I ask that you observe with a spirit of clinical detachment." Thondiwe and Becky stood at the front of the group, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes scanning the shimmering blue canopy with a look of profound skepticism. She didn't move toward the chalk lines. Instead, she shifted her weight, her gaze lingering on the way the blue petals pulsed in a slow, rhythmic tide. Beside her, a few other villagers lingered, their faces masked in a cautious, rural curiosity, as if they were approaching a downed aircraft or a crime scene. Then came Gisela. She didn't walk through the gates so much as she collided with them, her presence a sudden, jarring frequency that shattered Hanae's curated silence. Gisela was wearing a dress that looked like a repurposed circus tent, splashed with erratic streaks of ochre and crimson. She didn't wait for the instructions. She surged past Hanae, her arms wide and expansive, her fingers trailing across the leaves of a blue fern with a tactile hunger that made Hanae flinch. "Do you feel it?" Gisela shouted, her voice booming across the garden, theatrical and devoid of any filter. "The subconscious of the earth is screaming. It is a canvas, a living, breathing confessional." She spun in a circle, her dress whipping against the iridescent stems. "Look at this color. It is the hue of a suppressed desire, the shade of a secret kept for 20 years. Hanae stepped forward, her hand instinctively reaching for her glasses to push them up the bridge of her nose. "Ms. Varga, please. There is a protocol for this observation. If you could simply maintain a distance of—" But the garden had already responded to Gisela's arrival. The steady, rhythmic pulse of the blue flora suddenly fractured. As Gisela's manic energy rippled through the air, the plants began to strobe. The electric blue flashed violently into a searing neon yellow, then a deep magenta, then a blinding white, shifting colors every few seconds like a malfunctioning neon sign in a rain-slicked alley. The air grew heavy with the scent of static crackle and overripe peaches. The sensory overload was immediate. The villagers recoiled, several of them covering their eyes. The atmosphere, once one of cautious curiosity, curdled into a high-voltage tension. The garden was no longer a mirror, it had become an amplifier, turning Gisela's impulsivity into a visual scream. "It's reacting to her," Rohan exclaimed, appearing from the side path with his notebook clutched to his chest. He looked fascinated, though his eyes were wide with a hint of alarm. "The bioresonance is spiking. It's not just mirroring emotion anymore, it's accelerating it. The strobe effect is a feedback loop." "It is a disaster," Hanae countered, her voice tight. She felt a sudden, sharp pressure in her temples. The chaos of the flashing lights felt like a physical assault on her need for order. She tried to step toward Gisela to pull her away, but the crowd of locals had shifted, creating a clumsy barrier of anxious bodies. Among them was Mr. Sash. Henderson, a man who had lived in the village for 40 years and had spoken perhaps a total of 10 sentences to Hanae. He was a gray man in a gray cardigan, a fixture of the town's background who moved with a perpetual apologetic slouch. As the flashing colors intensified, Henderson seemed to shrink further into himself, his eyes darting around the garden with a frantic, hunted energy. In his haste to retreat from Gisela's booming laughter, he stumbled, his shoulder brushing against a solitary, pale white flower that grew in a secluded pocket of the garden, away from the blue iridescent surge. The reaction was instantaneous. The moment Henderson's skin touched the petal, the white bloom didn't just change color, it bruised. A deep, sickly purple bled from the center of the flower, spreading outward in jagged veins. Simultaneously, a scent erupted from the blossom, not the scent of a garden, but the sterile chemical tang of old hospital corridors and floor wax. It was a smell that triggered a visceral somatic memory in everyone present, a sudden, cold reminder of sickness and waiting rooms. Then, the air above the flower began to shimmer. A translucent, blurred image coalesced in the air, like a projection from a faulty film reel. It was a scene, fragmented and flickering, a younger Mr. Henderson, his face distorted by a sharp, cruel smile, handing a thick envelope of cash to a man in a dark suit, while in the background a woman wept silently against a brick wall. The image was grainy, but the betrayal was legible in the body language, the cold exchange of a secret that had been paid for in silence. A collective gasp rippled through the group. Thandiwe and Becky stepped forward, her eyes widening as she recognized the figures in the projection. The silence that followed was heavier than the strobe lights, a vacuum of shock that seemed to suck the oxygen from the air. "This is a lie," Henderson shrieked. His voice, usually a whisper, cracked into a jagged howl. He lunged at the flower, his face contorted with a sudden, raw panic. He brought his heel down on the plant, crushing the purple bloom into the mud with a violent thud. But the garden did not surrender. As Henderson fought the flower, the projection didn't vanish, it intensified. The image grew larger, more vivid, the sound of the woman's sobbing suddenly audible, a ghostly echo that vibrated through the soil. The more Henderson trampled the earth, the more the garden projected his shame, turning the garden into a cinema of his own making. He was fighting a ghost made of pollen and memory, and he was losing. "Lean into it, Arthur," Gisela laughed, her voice ringing out with a terrifying artistic glee. She didn't try to stop him. She watched the spectacle as if it were a gallery opening. The earth is finally speaking for the silenced. Look at the truth. It's beautiful in its brutality. "Stop this," Hanai yelled, stepping into the fray. She grabbed Henderson by the arm, trying to pull him away from the mud, but he was a dead weight of desperation. "Everyone, leave! This session is over. Leave the garden immediately." The crowd didn't need to be told twice. Panic erupted, not as a scream, but as a flurry of accusations and hushed, urgent whispers. The villagers scrambled back toward the gates, their eyes darting between the trembling Mr. Henderson and the shimmering image of his past. Thandiwe was the last to leave, casting one long, cold look at Henderson, a look that promised a reckoning in the town square before she disappeared through the iron bars. As the dust settled, and the strobe lights faded back into a low, humming blue, Hanai stood alone in the wreckage of her controlled observation. Her blazer was stained with mud, and her glasses were smudged. She looked down at the crushed purple flower, which was already beginning to knit itself back together, feeding on the residue of Henderson's terror. She walked slowly back to the gate to lock it, her movements mechanical. As she reached for the bolt, she noticed a small, square piece of cream-colored stationery pinned to the iron bar with a rusted nail. There was no signature, only a single sentence written in a sharp, precise hand that looked hauntingly like her own. "Some secrets are better left buried." Chapter 5. Chapter title: The Weeping Lilies. The iron gate had barely clicked shut when determined footsteps crunched across the gravel. Hanai did not look up from the cream-colored stationery in her hand. She held the paper by the edges, as if it were a contaminated slide, staring at the ink that mirrored her own precise, sloping cursive. The ink was still tacky, smelling of iron and old cedar. She had not written this note. The logical part of her brain, honed by 3 decades of grading papers in sterile university offices, insisted on a forgery. But the handwriting possessed the exact pressure she applied to every downstroke. "It is a matter of civic hygiene, Hanai." Thandiwe and Becky stood at the edge of the flower bed, arms crossed so tightly her knuckles were bleached bone. She wore a structured linen suit and a shade of oatmeal that suggested curated stability. Her face was a mask of polite concern, the kind used when informing a neighbor their dog has been digging in the petunias. But her eyes were hard, scanning the garden with clinical distaste. "Good morning, Thandiwe," Hanai said, tucking the note into her blazer pocket. "I assume you're referring to yesterday. It was an anomaly, a sudden surge in the soil's resonance, that I am currently documenting." Thandiwe stepped further into the garden, her heels sinking into the loam. She didn't look at the mud, she watched Hanai. "Terminology does not change the result. You have turned a private ancestral plot into a public confessional. This village operates on a social fabric woven from the things we agree not to discuss. Your blossoms are not resonating, Hanai. They are shouting. In a community this small, shouting is a luxury we cannot afford." Hanai straightened, her spine asserting a military rigidity. "The garden is a biological mirror. If the blooms are shouting, it is because the town has been screaming in silence for 40 years. From a botanical perspective, the soil is reacting to the emotional saturation of the visitors. It is a fascinating study in empathetic flora. "This is not a study," Thandiwe interrupted, her voice gaining a metal edge. "This is academic vanity. You are playing with the psychological plumbing of this town because you find the mechanics interesting. You treat our lives like specimens in a jar, ignoring the fact that when you break a seal, the smell stains. For the sake of the village's cohesion, you will shutter this farm. Now." As Thandiwe spoke, the air grew heavy, smelling of static and wet stone. Hanae noticed a cluster of white lilies nearby, elegant things with petals like polished porcelain. As Thandiwe's voice hardened, the lilies began to lean. It wasn't a slow wilt, it was a synchronized droop, as if an invisible weight had been placed upon them. The stems trembled, mirroring the tension in Thandiwe's jaw. "I can categorize this," Hanae thought. Stress-induced turgor loss. Stress-induced turgor loss, a reaction to cortisol levels. If I can map the grief, I can control it. But as she watched, a cold realization washed over her. She wasn't observing a specimen, she was watching a mirror. The garden wasn't reacting to the conversation. It was reacting to the woman. Thandiwe was projecting a wall of iron, and the flowers were buckling under the pressure of what that wall hid. Then the first drop fell. A heavy, translucent bead of liquid welled up from a lily's throat and splashed onto the toe of Thandiwe's shoe. Then another. Within seconds, the lilies were secreting a thick, salt-heavy brine. The water poured, drenching the soil and soaking into the expensive leather. Thandiwe recoiled, but the lilies leaned toward her, their weeping intensifying. The scent changed instantly. The floral sweetness vanished, replaced by the stinging smell of sea salt and old tears. "What is this?" Thandiwe demanded, her voice cracking, betraying a visceral panic. She stepped back, but more lilies erupted from the mud around her, their white petals stained with gray streaks, their heads bowing in a collective mourning gesture. Thandiwe's arms uncrossed. Her hand shook, fingers twitching against her suit. She looked down at the salt water pooling around her feet, and the mask shattered. The polite euphemisms and curated stability dissolved. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. "I cannot," Thandiwe whispered, her voice stripped of authority. "I cannot have this here." "Thandiwe?" Hanae reached out, but stopped midair. The lilies were no longer just weeping, they were sobbing. The sound was a low, humming vibration in the earth, a frequency of grief so dense it felt like a physical weight. Thandiwe's knees gave way. She collapsed into a nearby wrought iron chair, her body folding in on itself. A guttural, raw sob escaped her, a reservoir of sorrow that had finally breached its dam. She wept with a violence that shook her entire frame. The garden amplified the sound, the lilies pulsing in time with her heaving chest. Thandiwe wasn't just crying, she was being emptied. The brine continued to flow, creating a small salty lake around the chair, as if the earth were trying to wash away the decades of repression she had worn like armor. Hanae stood frozen. She felt a terrifying surge of empathy that threatened to pull her into the mud. She wanted to offer a tissue or a logical explanation, but realized any attempt to categorize this moment would be an insult. This wasn't a botanical event. It was a reckoning. After a long time, the weeping subsided into shuddering exhales. Thandiwe remained in the chair, her suit ruined, her face blotchy. She looked diminished, as if the garden had stripped away a layer of skin she had spent 40 years growing. Without a word, Thandiwe rose. She didn't regain her composure, she simply accepted her defeat. She walked out of the garden with a slow, dragging gait, leaving a trail of saltwater footprints. She looked like a ghost of the woman who had entered the gate. Hanae watched her disappear, then looked down at the lilies. The flowers were no longer weeping. They stood straight again, their petals a brilliant, blinding white, looking refreshed and cleansed. She reached into her pocket and felt the cream-colored stationery. A chill ran through her. She had spent her life believing that knowledge was a shield, that understanding a system allowed you to navigate it safely. But the farm was not a system to be understood. It was a force that stripped away defenses, leaving the soul naked. As she studied the pristine white lilies, Hanae wondered who would be the next to be peeled open, and whether she herself had enough layers left to survive the process. Chapter 6. Rohan had spent 4 days in a state of manic excavation, his fingernails permanently stained a bruised purple from the soil. He didn't just plant, he interrogated the earth. He had mapped the grid with a surveyor's precision, treating the flower beds like a laboratory floor. But the results were an affront to every textbook he had ever memorized. The sprouts emerging from his quadrant were not the elegant stalks of the ancestral records. They were twisted, corkscrew things, gray as wet ash and spiraling inward upon themselves in tight, suffocating knots. They looked like screams frozen in cellulose. "It is a mineral deficiency," Rohan said, though his voice lacked its usual academic velocity. He didn't look up as Hanaya approached. He was hunched over a particularly distorted shoot, his pocket notebook open to a page filled with frantic, overlapping diagrams of root systems. "The pH balance must be skewed. Or perhaps there is a heavy metal contaminant in this specific vein of soil. I can account for the anomalies if I can just isolate the variable." Hanai stopped a few feet away. She noticed a discarded tin of peppermint tea on a nearby stone, the liquid long since evaporated into a sticky brown ring. For weeks, she had watched him from the periphery, her mind automatically drafting a syllabus on how to guide him through this. She wanted to tell him that he was treating his grief like a math problem, and that the garden was simply reflecting the distortion of his internal geometry. She wanted to lecture him on the fallacy of the controlled variable when the variable was a broken heart. But as she studied the gray, spiraling plants, the memory of Thandue's saltwater footprints flashed through her mind. The academic shield she had worn for 30 years felt suddenly heavy and absurd, a costume that no longer fit. The urge to correct him, to teach him, to organize his chaos into a legible chart, simply evaporated. Without saying a word, Hanai stepped off the paved path. She didn't avoid the mud, she walked straight into it, the damp earth soaking through the fabric of her trousers. She sat down beside him, her knees sinking into the loam. She didn't offer a tissue or a theory. She didn't ask him to explain the corkscrew shapes. She simply sat, her back straight but her shoulders finally dropping, and leaned her shoulder against his. For a long time, the only sound was the distant, rhythmic thud of a woodpecker in the cedar grove. Rohan remained rigid at first, his pen poised over the paper like a weapon. He was waiting for the critique, the pedagogical intervention, the structured advice. When it didn't come, he slowly lowered the notebook. The silence between them wasn't the empty kind. It was dense and shared, a recognition of the ghosts they both carried, his sister's absence, her own long exile from herself. They sat in that shared gravity for an hour. Hanai watched a beetle struggle through a forest of gray spirals, and Rohan finally stopped rubbing the back of his neck. The tension in the air shifted, moving from a clash of two different intellectual defenses to a quiet, mutual surrender. They weren't trying to fix the garden, and they weren't trying to fix each other. They were simply two people who were tired of pretending that logic could bridge the gap between loss and living. Then, the ground between them shivered. It wasn't a violent tremor, but a soft, humming vibration that resonated in their chest cavities. Between their seated forms, a shoot broke the surface. It didn't spiral or weep. It rose with a slow, deliberate grace, the stem translucent as hand-blown glass. Within seconds, a single flower unfurled. Its petals were a shimmering, iridescent pearl, pulsing with a soft, rhythmic light that matched the cadence of two hearts beating in a synchronized, peaceful rhythm. As the bloom opened, it emitted a low, melodic frequency, a sound like a distant cello played in a cathedral. The light it cast was warm, washing over Rohan's gray, twisted plants and momentarily smoothing their jagged edges. Rohan stared at the flower. His hand moved toward his notebook, a reflex of 30 years of training, but he stopped. He watched the translucent petals, then at Hanai, and then back at the flower. He didn't reach for his pen. He didn't mention pH levels or mineral deficiencies. He simply closed the notebook with a decisive snap and let it fall into the dirt. "It doesn't make any sense," he whispered, but the fast-paced anxiety was gone. He sounded as if he were describing a miracle he had finally stopped trying to debunk. "I know," Hanai replied, her voice soft, devoid of its usual measured precision. "That's why it's true." They stayed there, bathed in the melodic light of the synchronicity bloom, feeling a rare, fragile equilibrium. For the first time since returning to the farm, Hanai felt the noise in her head settle into a hush. The world felt coherent, not because it was organized, but because it was felt. That peace lasted only until Hanai glanced toward the eastern perimeter. At the edge of the garden, where the lush greenery met the wild scrub of the coast, a streak of absolute black was advancing. It wasn't a shadow, it was a physical substance, a blight that moved with a predatory speed. It didn't just wither the plants it touched, it transformed them. As the blackness swept over a row of vibrant marigolds, the flowers didn't droop, they solidified. They turned into brittle, obsidian-like glass, their colors extinguished, their forms frozen in a state of sudden, violent crystallization. One of the glass stems snapped under the weight of a passing breeze, the sound a sharp, metal-sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot through the quiet garden. "What is that?" Rohan asked, standing up, his scientific curiosity returning, but this time laced with a genuine tremor of fear. Suleiman had appeared behind them without a sound, his carved wooden cane planting firmly in the dirt. He didn't look at the people. He studied the obsidian perimeter. His eyes were clouded, his expression one of deep, ancestral mourning. He slowly rolled the prayer beads through his fingers, the click, click, click of the wood providing a stark counterpoint to the shattering glass of the plants. "The mirror has found a new image to reflect," Suleiman said, his voice a low, rough rumble. "Is it a disease?" Hanaya asked, her instinct to categorize returning, though this time it felt like a plea for safety. "It is not a disease of the leaf, Hanai," Suleiman replied, leaning heavily on his cane as he watched a whole hedge of nightbloom scent turn to black glass in a single pulse of darkness. "The garden is no longer merely reflecting the hearts of those who walk within it. It is reacting. There is a resistance here, something deep, something buried in the soil or the soul of this town, that refuses to be healed. The land is not just mirroring us anymore, it is fighting back against the silence." As if to emphasize his words, a sudden gust of wind swept through the perimeter, and a dozen obsidian lilies shattered simultaneously, raining shards of black glass across the path like 1,000 broken mirrors. Chapter 7. Hanai stepped over the threshold of the garden's vitality and felt the temperature drop 10 degrees in a single stride. One moment she was surrounded by the pulsing, iridescent blue flora that had erupted from her and Rohan's shared grief. The next, she was standing on a surface that looked like crushed bone. The dead zone was a perfect circle, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, where the earth had been bleached to a stark ash white. Not a single blade of grass dared to breach the perimeter. No insects buzzed here. The air didn't just feel still, it felt vacant, as if the oxygen itself had been evacuated to make room for a heavy, suffocating vacuum. As she walked toward the center, a physical pressure mounted against her sternum. It was not the weight of a stone, but a psychic density, an atmospheric rejection that made every breath a conscious effort. Her lungs felt small, her ribs too tight. She reached up to adjust her glasses, but her fingers trembled, and she found herself smoothing the fabric of her linen trousers with a rhythmic, desperate intensity. This was a botanical impossibility. Even in the most sterile environments, salt flats or volcanic wastes, there is a baseline of microbial activity. But here, the soil was an absolute negation. It was a hole in the world. "You are walking into the heart of the silence," a voice rumbled behind her. Hanaya didn't turn. She didn't need to. The rhythmic, metal-sharp click of the carved wooden cane against the sterile earth told her exactly where Suleiman was. He stopped a few paces behind her, the sound of his arrival sharp and final. He didn't offer a hand or a word of comfort. He simply stood there, the scent of old cedar and dried tobacco clinging to him, his eyes clouded as he surveyed the white void. "Is it a chemical contaminant?" Hanaya asked. Her voice sounded thin, stripped of its usual academic resonance. She wanted to believe in a spill, a leak of some caustic agent from a forgotten shed, something she could map and remediate with a soil kit and a spreadsheet. "The land does not suffer from chemicals, Hanaya," Suleiman said. He stepped forward, his cane planting firmly in the ash. "It suffers from a memory that was never allowed to be spoken. This circle is the precise point where the air once froze. It is the geography of a scream that was swallowed whole." Hanaya stiffened, her military posture locking into place. "I don't follow." "Be specific, Suleiman. I cannot work with metaphors when the farm is literally crystallizing into glass." Suleiman let out a slow, rattling sigh. He rolled the prayer beads through his fingers, the click, click, click echoing in the oppressive quiet. "You were a child when the freeze happened. You were small enough to hide behind the curtains, but old enough to understand the sound of a door slamming for the last time. Do you remember the night your parents stopped speaking? Not the argument, the silence that followed it?" Hanai felt a sudden, sharp spike of vertigo. She had spent 30 years building a fortress of credentials and pedagogical structures to wall off the childhood she had fled. She had categorized her parents' relationship as a failure of communication, in the clinical sense, a data point in a history of dysfunctional lineage. But as she stood in the center of the white circle, the fortress began to shudder. "They had a disagreement," she said, her voice precise and cold. It was a common domestic rupture. It is irrelevant to the current state of the soil. It was not a rupture, Suleiman countered, his voice gaining a rough edge. It was an erasure. I watched from the porch. I watched your father gather every notebook, every scrap of poetry, every ink-stained journal your mother had kept for a decade. He didn't just take them, he built a pyre right here in the center of this garden. The memory hit Hanae with the force of a physical blow. She saw it now, not as a blurred image, but in high-definition clarity. The orange tongues of fire licking the cream-colored paper, the smell of burning leather and old ink, and the sight of her mother standing perfectly still, her face a mask of absolute hollowed-out grief. Her mother hadn't screamed. She hadn't fought. She had simply ceased to engage with the world. For years after that night, the house had been a museum of unspoken things. The silence had been so thick, it felt like a third inhabitant of the home, a cold presence that sat at the dinner table and slept in the hallways. As the memory surfaced, the ground beneath Hanae's feet began to vibrate. It started as a low hum, a frequency that resonated in her teeth. Then, with a sudden violent shift, the ash-white soil began to bleed color. It wasn't a gradual change, it was a saturation. The white vanished, replaced by a deep, bruised indigo, a color so dark it felt like a bruise on the skin of the earth. The vibration intensified, shaking the soles of her shoes, mirroring the sudden erratic thumping of her own heart. The mask is breaking, Suleiman observed. He didn't sound triumphant, he sounded pained. Hanae looked down at the indigo earth and felt a sudden, terrifying realization. The void wasn't a botanical failure or a mysterious blight. It was her. It was the exact shape of the space she had carved out inside herself to survive her own history. She had spent 3 decades pretending she was a creature of logic and order, while the indigo grief of her lineage had been waiting in the soil, patient and heavy. The academic mask, the precision, the terminology, the distance, didn't just crack, it shattered, leaving her raw and exposed to the wind. Driven by a sudden, irrational impulse, Hanae knelt. She wanted to touch the color, to feel the texture of the memory she had spent a lifetime ignoring. She reached out, her fingers inches from the bruised soil, desperate to find some point of connection. Just as her fingertips brushed the surface, a surge of emotional energy erupted from the ground. It wasn't a spark, but a wave of pure, kinetic sorrow. The force hit her like a physical shoulder to the chest, throwing her backward. She collapsed onto the perimeter of the circle, her breath knocked out of her, her glasses sliding crookedly across her face. She lay there for a long moment, gasping for air, the scent of static crackle and old burnt paper filling her nostrils. The indigo soil settled, returning to a simmering, dark glow. The pressure on her chest had vanished, replaced by a hollow ache that felt far more dangerous than the suffocating vacuum of the dead zone. Suleiman looked down at her, his expression a mixture of pity and a grim, ancestral hope. He didn't offer to help her up. Instead, he leaned heavily on his cane, his gaze drifting toward the obsidian blight still creeping toward the center of the farm. "The land is finally asking you for the truth, Hanae," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "But be careful. The garden does not take payments in apologies. It demands a price in authenticity, and I fear you are not yet ready to pay it." Chapter 8. Hanae spent 3 hours arranging the wrought iron chairs in a precise semicircle, ensuring the distance between each seat was exactly 24 inches. She had used a measuring tape, a habit that felt like a lifeline as she studied the invitation list. She wanted this to be a structured dialogue, a guided reflection with clear objectives and defined boundaries. She had even drafted an agenda on a yellow legal pad, though she kept it tucked into her apron pocket, a hidden script for a play she hoped wouldn't turn into a tragedy. The air smelled of damp loam and the sharp tang of a coming storm, a scent that clung to the back of her throat. Thandiwe arrived first, her presence a sudden sharp line against the soft greens of the perimeter. She wore a dress of stiff pressed linen and a smile that stayed cold, a social mask so polished it looked like porcelain. She didn't walk so much as glide, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze scanning the farm, not with curiosity, but with the clinical eye of a warden assessing a breach in security. She stopped a few feet from Hanae, her nodding slow and deliberate, a silent acknowledgement of the invitation that felt more like a summons to a deposition. "It is a bold gesture, Hanae," Thandiwe said, her voice a warm, guarded velvet. "Bringing the village here to, what was the term in your letter? Collective healing? Some things are better left to the quiet of the hearth than the exposure of a garden. The land doesn't recognize the difference between a hearth and a garden, Thandiwe, Hanai replied, her posture military, her glasses sliding slightly down the bridge of her nose. It only recognizes what is being withheld. I believe if we can simply articulate the friction, we can stabilize the soil. Thandiwe's smile tightened. Articulation is one thing. Excavation is another. Before Hanai could respond, the silence was shattered by a loud theatrical gasp. Gisela Varga burst through the hedge, her arms expansive, her silk scarf trailing behind her like a banner of war. She was vibrating, a human tuning fork tuned to a frequency of pure disruption. She didn't walk to the circle, she spiraled into it, touching every leaf and petal she passed, her fingers dancing over the iridescent blooms with a tactile hunger that made Hanai instinctively step back. "Look at this. The tension is practically humming," Gisela exclaimed, her voice leaping an octave. She stopped in front of Thandiwe, her eyes wide and sparkling with a dangerous sort of glee. "Can you feel it, Thandiwe? The air is thick with all the little lies you've told to keep this town feeling like a postcard. It's delicious." Thandiwe didn't flinch, but her knuckles whitened where she gripped her own arms. "Gisela, your enthusiasm for chaos is, as always, a marvel of inefficiency." As the rest of the townspeople filtered in quiet, wary figures who moved like ghosts through the foliage, Hanai stepped into the center of the semicircle. She felt the old weight of the classroom settle over her, the invisible podium that had protected her for 30 years. She cleared her throat, her voice regaining that measured, pedagogical authority, the tone she used to ensure no student dared to interrupt a lecture on botanical history. "Thank you all for coming," Hanai began, her hands clasped firmly in front of her. "The goal of this gathering is not to resolve every grievance in a single afternoon, but to acknowledge the emotional resonance of this land. We will begin with a guided reflection. I ask that you each identify one singular tension you carry and imagine it as a root. We will not speak it aloud yet, but we will allow the garden to witness it." "A guided reflection," Gisela scoffed, her voice booming. She leaned back in her chair, the metal screeching against the stone. "Why the theater, Hanai? Why the scripts? Let's stop pretending we're in a seminar. Let's ask why the matriarchs of our village spend her nights worrying that a few flowers might tell the truth about who actually owns the creek bed, or why the old mill was burned in '84. The reaction was instantaneous. The iridescent blue flora, which had been pulsing with a steady, rhythmic glow, suddenly spiked. The soft, curved petals snapped into jagged, obsidian-edged shards. They didn't just grow, they lunged, the stems elongating with a violent clicking sound, turning the beauty of the garden into a thicket of glass-like needles. The townspeople recoiled, a collective gasp rippling through the group. "That is quite enough," Thandiwe snapped, her voice cutting through the air like a guillotine. She stood up, her face a mask of frozen indignation. "We will have decorum, or we will leave. I will not have this ancestral property turned into a circus for the amusement of an expatriate who treats grief as a performance piece. Silence, Gisela." As the word silence left Thandiwe's lips, a sudden, unnatural chill swept across the circle. It wasn't a breeze, it was a wave of static frost. Hanai watched in horror as a shimmering white rime crept across the jagged blossoms. The frost didn't settle on the petals, it consumed them, turning the vibrant, jagged shapes into brittle, translucent sculptures of ice. The air became so cold that Hanai's breath emerged in ragged white plumes, and the scent of static crackle replaced the smell of earth. The friction between Thandiwe's rigid demand for order and Gisela's hunger for exposure created a psychic storm that the land could no longer buffer. The atmosphere thickened, turning a bruised, heavy purple. Then the collapse began. It wasn't a slow decline, but a sudden, catastrophic failure. The frost-covered petals began to melt, but they didn't return to their original state. They liquefied. Hanai zoomed in on a single blossom near her foot. She watched as the iridescent blue bled out of the petal, replaced by a sickly, translucent gray. The structure of the plant dissolved in real time, the cellular walls collapsing into a viscous, shimmering slime that smelled of old metal tang and stagnant water. The petals fell not as leaves, but as heavy, wet droplets, slapping against the soil like rain made of lead. "What is happening?" someone whispered, the voice trembling. "You're killing it," Gisela said, though her voice had lost its theatricality, replaced by a genuine, wide-eyed shock. "We're killing it." Thandiwe looked at her hands, then at the gray slurry that had once been a miracle of nature. For the first time, the porcelain mask cracked, revealing a raw, pulsing fear. The townspeople stood in a stunned silence, realizing that their inability to coexist, the clash between a silence that suffocated and a truth that screamed, was physically eroding the ground beneath them. The garden was no longer mirroring them, it was dying from them. Just as the last of the perimeter flowers collapsed into gray slime, a sound tore through the silence. It wasn't a thunderclap or a scream. It was a loud, ominous crack that seemed to originate from the very marrow of the earth. It came from the center of the dead zone, a deep grinding sound of stone splitting against stone. The vibration traveled up through the soles of Hanaya's shoes, a violent shudder that knocked several chairs backward. In the sudden, terrifying quiet that followed, a thin, black fissure appeared in the center of the gray wasteland, slowly widening like an opening eye, exhaling a cold, subterranean wind that smelled of ancient, forgotten things. Chapter 9. Hanaya stood at the lip of the fissure, the subterranean wind whipping her hair across her glasses. The smell of the void was not rot, but something colder, the scent of iron and wet slate, like a tomb opened after a century of silence. Around her, the townspeople were statues of salt, their faces illuminated by the sickly, translucent gray of the liquefied blossoms. The garden had become a mirror of their collective paralysis, a shimmering slurry of failure that clung to the soles of her sensible shoes. Thandiwe stood a few paces back, her arms crossed so tightly her knuckles were white. She wasn't looking at the fissure, she was looking at Hanaya, her gaze a heavy weight of expectation and judgment. To Thandiwe, this was the inevitable result of Hanaya's intrusion, the ancestral home returning to the earth because a stranger had tried to curate its soul. Beside her, Gisela was vibrating, her fingers twitching as if she wanted to reach into the black crack and pull something out by the roots. The silence was a physical pressure, a vacuum that sucked the air from Hanaya's lungs. In Hanaya's right hand was her leather-bound planner, the spine reinforced with synthetic fabric, its pages filled with meticulous grids, categorized soil pH levels, and a 3-month trajectory for the farm's emotional restoration. It was her shield, the academic fortress she had built to keep the chaos of her lineage at bay. She looked down at the grids, the neat black lines of a woman who believed that if she could just organize the grief, it would stop hurting. She realized then that the planner was not a tool for healing. It was a ledger of her own cowardice. She had come back to this farm not to cultivate it, but to manage it, to treat the land like a classroom where the students could be graded and the outcomes predicted. "You can't organize a miracle, Hanaya," Suleiman said, his voice a low, rough rumble that seemed to rise from the soil itself. He didn't move from his position, leaning heavily on his carved wooden cane, his prayer beads clicking in a slow, rhythmic cadence. He didn't sound angry, he sounded tired. "You are trying to teach a language to a forest that only speaks in heartbeats. Your maps are useless here because you refuse to be lost." Something in Hanaya snapped. It wasn't a loud break, but a quiet, internal surrender, like a dam finally yielding to the weight of a river. The rigid posture she had maintained for 30 years, the military spine, the precise tilt of the chin, collapsed. A sudden, violent tremor seized her hand. With a guttural sound that was half sob and half laugh, she flung the leather-bound planner into the gray slime. It landed with a wet, heavy thud, the pages splaying open to reveal a meticulously planned schedule for Tuesday's irrigation. The ink began to bleed immediately, the black wines dissolving into the translucent gray slurry. "I don't know how to do this," Hanaya screamed, the sound tearing through the heavy purple atmosphere. She didn't care about the precision of her tone or the dignity of her position. She stepped closer to the edge of the fissure, her voice cracking. "I spent 30 years pretending that if I read enough books, if I followed enough rules, I could erase the fact that I am terrified of everything this family stands for. I am broken, and I am a failure, and I have no idea how to fix any of this." She sank to her knees in the muck, the gray slime soaking through the fabric of her trousers. She didn't try to smooth her clothes, she didn't adjust her glasses. She simply sat there, shivering, her breath coming in ragged, uneven plumes. She allowed herself to be seen, not as the retired educator, not as the botanical expert, but as a woman who had spent 3 decades running away from a ghost. For a moment, the wind from the fissure intensified, howling with a prehistoric hunger. Then, the ground beneath Hanaya's knees pulsed. A single blinding needle of light pierced through the center of the dead zone, erupting from the black fissure with a violence that forced the crowd to recoil. It wasn't a slow growth. It was an explosion of iridescent flora, a towering spire of blossoms that defied every law of botany. The petals were not a single color, but a shifting kaleidoscope of opal, amethyst, and burning gold, pulsing in a slow, rhythmic thrum that matched the beat of a human heart. As the bloom reached its zenith, it released a cloud of shimmering pollen that drifted over the assembled townspeople like a veil of crushed diamonds. As the fragrance hit them, a scent of rain on hot stone and old letters, the air shifted. The walls of isolation that had defined the village for generations didn't just crack, they vanished. Thandiwe gasped, her hand flying to her throat. She didn't see Hanai anymore, she saw a flash of a memory that wasn't hers. She felt the crushing loneliness of the neighbor she had shunned for 10 years. The coldness of an empty house, the smell of stale tea, the longing for a simple conversation. The empathy was an electrical current, raw and unfiltered. Thandiwe's face crumpled. The porcelain mask shattered completely, leaving behind a woman who looked small and frightened. Slowly, trembling, Thandiwe reached out and grasped the hand of the woman beside her, their fingers interlocking in a grip of desperate, sudden recognition. Around them, the garden responded to this sudden surge of honesty. The gray slurry vanished, replaced by a tide of shifting colors that mirrored the collective catharsis. Deep crimson blooms erupted where anger had been admitted. Soft, luminous whites blossomed where forgiveness was felt. The air became a symphony of fragrance and light, a living tapestry of the town's shared subconscious. Gisela, who had spent the entire afternoon trying to provoke a reaction, fell completely silent. She stood with her arms at her sides, her theatricality stripped away. She studied the towering, iridescent spire, and then at the people around her, her eyes wide with a genuine, quiet awe. For the first time, she didn't need to scream to be heard. The silence was now full of everything that needed to be said. Hanai remained on her knees, watching the light fade from the sky. The iridescent spire slowly settled, its glow dimming into a soft, steady luminescence. She looked down at the earth beneath her. The gray, sterile wasteland was gone. In its place was soil that looked like crushed velvet, a deep, fertile black that smelled of ancient minerals and new beginnings. It was a soil that had been purged of its toxins, ready to receive whatever seeds the future held. Suleiman approached her, the rhythmic click of his beads the only sound in the newfound peace. He reached down, his weathered hand gripping her shoulder with a strength that surprised her. He didn't offer a platitude or a lesson. He simply looked at the black earth and then at her. "The land no longer remembers your fear, Hanai," he said, his voice like grinding stones. "But it has a very long memory for the truth." Hanai looked at the black fissure, which had narrowed to a thin silver line. The wind had stopped, but the air still felt charged, as if the earth were holding its breath. She thought of the planter rotting in the mud and felt a lightness in her chest that terrified her more than the fissure ever had. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice small. Suleiman looked toward the horizon, where the obsidian blight still lingered in the distance, a dark smudge against the twilight. "The fever has broken," he replied, "but the wound is still open." Chapter 10. Thandiwe's hands were deep in the loam, her knuckles stained a bruised purple from the juice of crushed berries. She wasn't directing the effort from the periphery, or smoothing over the jagged edges of the conversation with a polite smile. Instead, she was kneeling beside a row of lilies that pulsed with a soft amber light, her breath hitching every few seconds in a rhythm that matched the slow flicker of the petals. Beside her, a small group of villagers worked in a silence that was no longer heavy, but porous. They moved like a single organism, weeding the patches of gray that still clung to the corners of the plot, their movements synchronized by the shared humming of the earth beneath them. Hanai watched them from the edge of the trellis, her own linen trousers ruined by streaks of black mud. For 30 years, her identity had been a series of right angles and ironed creases. Now, she felt the grit of the soil beneath her fingernails as a kind of liberation. She didn't reach for her glasses to analyze the pH of the soil or consult a chart on seasonal bloom cycles. Instead, she leaned into the wind, smelling the sharp, sharp tang of static crackle mixed with something like crushed cinnamon and old memories. She spent her mornings not in the library, but in the dirt, letting the unpredictability of the blossoms dictate her pace. When a flower turned a sudden, jarring shade of indigo, she didn't ask why, she simply sat with it, allowing the wave of sudden, inexplicable nostalgia to wash over her until the color softened into a pale lavender. "The chlorophyll levels are irrelevant here, aren't they?" Rohan asked, stepping up beside her. He was still carrying his pocket notebook, but he wasn't scribbling data points. He was holding a single, translucent stem that vibrated with a low frequency, echoing the steady thrum of his own heartbeat. He studied the plant not as a specimen to be dissected, but as a mirror. I spent so long trying to find the chemical catalyst for the resonance. I wanted a formula for grief so I could solve it like an equation. Hanae looked at him, noticing how the tension in his shoulders had finally surrendered. We can still observe the patterns, Rohan, but the observation has to be a conversation, not an interrogation. Together they began a new kind of study. They tracked the migration of colors across the acreage, noting how a bloom of deep emerald would spread when Thandiwe spoke openly about her failures as a leader, or how the iridescent blues flared whenever Rohan thought of his sister. They stopped trying to categorize the magic and started trying to feel the cadence of it, blending the precision of botany with the messy, intuitive art of empathy. Thandiwe stood up, wiping her hands on a rag. She studied the townspeople, people she had spent decades managing through carefully constructed silences. I spent too long believing that stability was the absence of noise, she said, her voice carrying across the garden, devoid of its usual guarded polish. I thought if I kept the fence high enough, the ghosts wouldn't find a way in. I was wrong. The ghosts were already here, just starving for air. There was a collective exhale, a shimmering ripple of gold that swept through the surrounding flora, a visual manifestation of a shared burden being set down. Hanae felt a sudden spike of vertigo. Is this what it means to let go? She wondered. To exist in a space where the internal is external, where there is no wall between the thought and the world. She thought of her decades in the university, the sterile whiteboards, the rigid syllabi, the way she had curated her life like a museum exhibit, beautiful, static, and utterly dead. The terror of the unknown had always been her primary motivator, the engine that drove her toward order. Now, looking at the chaotic, pulsing tapestry of the farm, she realized that the order she had craved was actually a form of hibernation. She had been sleeping for 30 years, and the awakening was violent and fragrant and terrifyingly beautiful. She felt a sudden, sharp longing for the simplicity of a textbook, followed immediately by a wave of disgust at the thought of returning to a world where a flower was just a flower. From the porch of the main house, Suleiman watched the scene. He sat in his carved wooden chair, the rhythmic click of his prayer beads the only clock that mattered. He saw the way the townspeople leaned on one another, the way the garden absorbed their sorrows and breathed back hope. The heavy mantle of the secret keeper, a weight he had carried until his spine had curved like a bow, had finally slipped from his shoulders. He was no longer the only one who knew the language of the land. The land had finally decided to speak to everyone. Hanae walked toward him, her footsteps heavy in the velvet soil. She stopped at the base of the porch, looking up at the weathered lines of his face. The sun was dipping low, casting long, amber shadows across the valley, and the obsidian blight on the distant horizon seemed less like a threat and more like a scar, a reminder of what had been survived. It looks peaceful, Hanae said, though she knew peace was a deceptive word. Suleiman closed his eyes, listening to the wind rustle through the iridescent leaves. Peace is not the absence of the wound, Hanae. It is the acceptance of the scar. He opened his eyes, his gaze steady and ancient. The land is healed, yes, but the memory of the sterility remains. We must keep that memory, or we will forget how to tend to the broken parts of ourselves when the winter comes again. He didn't offer her a map for the future or a set of instructions. He simply nodded toward the center of the farm, where the black soil was deepest and the air felt thickest with possibility. Hanae understood. Healing wasn't a destination she could mark on a calendar or a goal she could achieve through discipline. It was a cycle, a constant oscillation between growth and decay, between the bloom and the rot. To resist the decay was to resist the life itself. She walked away from the porch and toward the heart of the garden, her bare feet sinking into the cool, damp earth. As she reached the center, something caught the fading light. In the middle of a patch of deep, fertile black, a single shoot had emerged. It was small, barely an inch high, but it didn't resemble anything she had seen in her botanical texts or within the farm's current repertoire. The stem was a translucent silver, and the budding flower was a color that defied naming. A hue that existed in the blind spot of the human eye, shifting between a deep, resonant void and a blinding celestial light. Hanae knelt before it, her breath catching. This wasn't a reflection of grief, or joy, or anger. It was something new. An emotion the land was preparing them for, a feeling for which they had no word and no precedent. As she reached out to touch the petal, the flower pulsed, and a sudden, electric shiver of anticipation raced up her arm, leaving her wondering what version of herself would be required to survive the coming bloom.